Coleman by Monica Furlong. Chapter 5. "What if the soldiers catch us?" Cormac asked. We were sitting round, the five of us, having a late breakfast and talking of our impressions of the day before. Sooner or later we are bound to run into them, and they will probably recognize that we are not Castle Door people. "Perhaps not in the case of the children," said Juniper, nodding at Wise Child and me. "The soldiers probably see the local children as a kind of mob. There are a lot of them." "But they would recognize ours as outsiders if they heard them speak," put in Finbar. "I can't see what alternative we have but to try to stay out of their way and hope for the best," Juniper said. There was silence between us all as we considered a number of unpleasant possibilities. I could not forget the nasty moment when they were trying the handle of the royal apartments, while Wise Child and I lay trembling inside. Cormac suddenly said, "The soldiers have gone from the village, by the way. I crept out early this morning and had a word with Lion, and he said that they left in the night. What he also said, however, was that Perquin is expected to visit in a week. When he does so, the whole community will be called together on the grass outside Castle Door and given a speech of threats and warnings designed to make them feel more intimidated." "I'd like to hear that," said Juniper. "Find out what sort of thing he says." "Too risky," Finbar said. "You are too tall to blend in as a native, even though you are one." "We could go, however," said Wise Child. "We could get Lion to take us along as if we were his grandchildren." Juniper said herself that probably all the children look alike to the soldiers. "I don't like the idea," Finbar said, his eyes on Wise Child. "They'd blend in all right," said Cormac. "You'd need to get hold of those rusty-colored jerkins the children here wear. I especially noticed that they all seem to have them." Juniper listened to all of this and nodded slowly. One of the things I have always admired about her is that, unlike most grown-ups, she is not in the habit of feeling that children must never do anything dangerous, though occasionally she says a warning word or two. My dad would have rejected out of hand something as risky as our going to hear Perquin, partly to show that he was in charge and we had to do what he said. "I want to talk about the business of arms," said Finbar. "When we discussed the possibility of my going to buy weapons and armor for the outlaws yesterday, you said that cost would not be a problem. What did you mean? Good quality weapons are expensive things, as you must well know." "Oh, yes," said Juniper, as if he had just reminded her of something she had forgotten. "Come with me." Intrigued, we followed her into what had been her parents' bedroom, and then out of it again into the huge closet, almost a room, where Erlaine had kept her clothes. There was a press, a huge piece of furniture, made of some rare pale wood that contained a brilliant array of Erlaine's dresses. Juniper pushed these aside to reveal a large panel of beautifully grained wood. For a moment, as she ran her fingers along the grain and pushed against the panel, Juniper seemed perplexed. Then suddenly the panel began to slide under her fingers, revealing a dark hole in which we could dimly see large leather bags. Juniper heaved out one of the bags. It was obviously very heavy. Untied the lacing round the top, and took out a handful of gold coins. "There is plenty more," she said simply. "This was my father's safe place. No one knows of it but me and possibly Brangwyn. And now all of you." I became aware that my mouth was hanging open and hastily closed it again. "Well," said Finbar, "that will certainly pay for weapons for the men of Castle Door. In fact, it would pay to hire a troop of soldiers to fight on Castle Dor's behalf." "I know," said Juniper, "but you did not mention it yesterday." "I am not sure yet that it is the way forward." Finbar nodded. "We need to know more about Brangwen and other things, and we need the people here to feel that they are in charge of their destiny. The worst thing that has happened to them is to be made to feel powerless. So let us see about weapons first, and then we could discuss whether we need to pay men to fight for us. I have to say that if men are going to fight, I would rather they did it out of conviction than for money." "Even if they lost the battle because there were not enough soldiers?" Finbar said. "No, I would not want them to lose," said Juniper, "but let's leave that for a bit. The immediate question is, how do we get all that heavy money onto your ship?" "There are a number of donkeys in the village," Cormac said. "Probably 4 bags would cover your expenses. 6 to be on the safe side. If we could distribute the weight of 6 bags, I think the donkeys could manage." Finbar nodded. "So I run the Holy Trinity into the harbour here, pick up the money, and sail to Ireland. I know the very place, where I have bought armour and swords for trading before now." "When do you think you could pick up the money?" Cormac asked. Finbar thought for a moment. "It will take me a day and a bit to walk back to the ship," he calculated. "Then allow another day to sail round here, unless the weather does something extraordinary. Say in 2 nights' time. I think it would be unwise for me to anchor in the bay by daylight. At the very least, it might make the soldiers curious. So I will come in at night. You will see the riding lights on my ship. Not many ships sail past here, as you will have noticed, and I would rather not give a signal unless I have to. But I will need to know that it is safe to come into the bay and drop anchor. The question is, how will I know?" We all looked at one another. I had an idea. "What if we lit a fire on that ledge halfway down the cliff?" I said, "provided the wind is not blowing on shore. It should not show too much, if at all, in the village, though maybe there would be a glow, I don't know. It would be all right so long as the soldiers were not paying us a visit." "No fire, no dropping anchor," said Finbar, nodding. "But if I see the fire, I will sail into the harbour, and you can lead the donkeys down." Wise Child suddenly spoke up. "How long will the trip to Ireland take?" she asked. Finbar regarded her quietly for a moment, and I was reminded of all the time he had already spent away from her on his many voyages. "Only a few days to get there," he said. "There will be swords, daggers, and pikes all ready for sale, but probably not enough, and we shall need helmets and breastplates of different sizes." He paused, then regretfully said, "It will probably take at least a month for them to get the work done." We were all a bit shocked by this, especially Wise Child, whose face seemed to close up. It was comforting to have Finbar around, and the thought of him leaving us for so long made us feel more vulnerable. But of course, there was no choice. Attempting to lighten the mood, Finbar smiled at Wise Child and playfully asked, "So what will you do while I am gone?" "Well, I have a plan," said Wise Child unexpectedly, "but I am not ready to talk about it yet." Finbar suddenly looked uneasy. "You won't do anything without telling anybody," he said. "No, of course not," Wise Child said. "We're all together in this. I learned that yesterday. It's just that I want a bit more time in order to think about it and to learn some things." Juniper eyed her thoughtfully, but said nothing. One of the things that Wise Child wanted to learn, I soon discovered, was to talk the Cornish language. leaving Juniper, Finbar, and Cormac to their planning. Wise Child and I visited Lion's house, where Wise Child pestered Lion and his wife to repeat ordinary words to her. On our way home, I asked her, "Is learning Cornish to do with your secret plan?" "It might be." "Will you share the secret with me?" "Very soon, I promise. I'm not keeping it from you just to be mean." "Will I be part of it?" "Yes, you will." Her eyes gleamed as she said this. "It is lovely to see you sort of more alive again," I said tentatively. "I know," Wise Child said. "I felt so miserable I hardly knew what to do with myself, and now I don't. In fact, I feel full of energy." Juniper called to us as we came in. Finbar suggested that we needed 2 alternative signals, one to say that it was safe, the other to warn him if the soldiers arrived in the middle of the operation. "You are in charge of this, Coleman," said Finbar. "The others have to get the gold down the cliff, but you will wait at the ledge to man the signal." "Right," I said. "If it is safe, I light the fire. If danger approaches, I will douse it." "Better make sure you have plenty of fuel then," said Finbar. "You don't want the fire to go out through lack of wood." "Suppose it is a foggy night?" I asked. "There is often fog round here." "If it is foggy, I shall have to leave and return later," said Finbar. "We cannot risk getting caught, though I don't feel the danger is great. I am going now to discuss it all with Lion. The outlaws must approve what we are doing." While Finbar was gone, Juniper tipped out some of the golden coins on the bedroom floor. Wise Child and I were absolutely entranced by them, picking them up and running them through our fingers. We entertained ourselves until Finbar returned. The long meeting in the Cave of the Mermaids, the exchange of ideas between Juniper and Finbar and the outlaws, and the action of Wise Child, which had shown such a clear concern for their safety, had seemed to bring us much closer to the people of Castle Dor. There was no difficulty about borrowing the donkeys. Finbar had Lion with him. Lion was obviously astonished, in spite of what Juniper had said the day before, that there were means to help pay for the weapons and armor the men needed. "And there is more money if you need it," Juniper told him earnestly. "Would it be possible for you to buy food from other peoples nearby to help feed your families?" He seemed doubtful of this, saying that they, too, were under the heel of the Grey Knight, but that, in any case, it would be difficult to bring back large quantities of food, of meat or flour, say, without risk of being caught by Perquin's men and suffering terrible punishment as a result. Lion insisted on only one thing. Rather than having Finbar's men lower a boat from the Holy Trinity and come ashore, he felt that it would be better if one of Castle Dor's own small fishing boats put out from the harbor once the donkeys had got down there with the money. In case of interruption, it would make you less vulnerable, Lion said. Whatever happened, you could get away. Finbar agreed, admitting that the local men knew the rocks of the cove as he and his men did not. And then Finbar was gone, and all of us were slightly subdued because of it. To keep her spirits up, Wise Child started to play a game of Finchnell against herself. She set out the pieces for 2 players and arranged a chair on each side of the table. After she made a move, she went and sat on the opposite chair and solemnly thought out how to counteract the first move. "I am practicing being 2 people," she said when I finally asked her about it. "One of them is the kind of person who is determined to win at all costs. The other is a person who is totally indifferent to winning. I want to see who comes off best." I noticed Juniper listening very hard to this conversation. "So who does come off best?" she asked. "I'm not sure, because I sometimes forget which is which," Wise Child answered honestly. "Or rather, both of them want to win, and I don't know how to make one of them indifferent, but I like trying." So this strange game was going on in one corner of the royal apartments, while in another Cormac was repairing a pair of shoes. Juniper wandered down the passageway to Erlaine's bedroom. After a moment I followed her and found her sitting absolutely silent and still, in a way she had that made you think how much everyone else talked and fidgeted. I sat down next to her, and after a bit I said, "So, what about uni and all the magic stuff? What's going to happen about that?" At first I thought she was not going to reply, but then she said, "That comes later. I had a nasty moment of foreboding." "Will it be very dangerous?" "At times, yes. But we have our protections and our own good sense." "Could we be killed or imprisoned?" "I guess we could, but we shall try not to." It was not very comforting, and yet I knew Juniper always spoke the truth. Suddenly Wise Child called out, "I want to say something." Juniper and I sat and waited. Wise Child had always been good at a dramatic pause. Finally she came in and sat down on the far side of the room. "I want to make a suggestion," she said. Something in her manner made me sense that she was a little nervous. Juniper said nothing. "You remember," Wise Child said, "that you thought we needed to infiltrate Caerleon, partly to get the feel of what was going on there, partly to try and find out more about Prince Brangwen. The Castle Door people were unhappy about that. They said that nobody who went to Caerleon was allowed to return home, and they just did not want to go. And you and Finbar can't go because Marut might recognize you. It occurred to me then that I could go, with Cormac and Coleman if they would agree. We could offer ourselves as servants. That way no one would pay attention to us. We would count for nothing, and that would mean that we had all the more chance to observe. It would be obvious from our speech that we are not local people, though I think we should try to learn a bit of Cornish beforehand. Sooner or later we could try to smuggle information out, if necessary, along the route that you told the outlaws about, which you and Finbar used to escape from the castle before." I found myself watching Juniper's face as this speech went on. Allowing children to do dangerous things was one thing, but letting us go into the very stronghold of the enemy was quite another. I felt quite choky at the thought of it, and rather hoped that Juniper would say it was completely out of the question. Instead, she called to Cormac, "Could you come here a moment?" When he came, a shoe he was stitching still in his hand, she asked Wise Child to repeat what she had just said. Cormac's face reflected the astonishment I had felt myself. He sat down rather quickly and said, "That is a very bold idea, Wise Child." Juniper fixed Wise Child with her beautiful dark eyes and said, very earnestly, "Why are you suggesting this?" Wise Child considered. "I suppose I just have a sense it would work," she said. "I agreed with you when you said it was one of the things that needed to be done. There is no one else to go, no one who sees the situation as we see it, I mean. We have the protections Coleman found on the mountain, and somehow I feel that we are meant to succeed." "Do you feel fear?" Juniper asked, maybe thinking of the wise child who had been terrorized by the trial and the escape. Yes, of course I do, said Wise Child. The Grey Knight and Marut are dangerous, cruel people. It's just that, well, you have taught me that the job of a Doran is to take on people like them. When you are fully trained, grown up, old enough to choose such risks yourself, Juniper said softly. Perhaps it is not about age and training, said Wise Child, but about willingness. She looked at Juniper with wide blue eyes that were not very childlike. She was a world away from the young girl who had just been playing with the Finchnell pieces. Wise Child and Juniper gazed at each other silently for a minute or two, and then Juniper got up and walked out of the room. Wise Child shrugged and went back to another game of Finchnell. Cormac went back to repairing his shoe. It was as if the three of them had shelved the important question. Or had Juniper ruled it out? I did not know. I sat alone, feeling disturbed. Entering Caerleon was a terrifying project, but I felt Wise Child meant what she said. It was nearly dark by the time Juniper returned. Cormac, Wise Child, and I were preparing supper by then, and the four of us sat down at the table together. I'm appalled by what you said, Juniper said abruptly to Wise Child. I think the risks are enormous, and although the protections will help, you and Coleman are not knowledgeable about using them. Also, we would need to talk to Finbar. I purposely did not mention it while he was here, said Wise Child, with a touch of her old crossness. He'd be bound to forbid it. That was foolish of you. You could not do anything like that without his consent. Then it won't happen, said Wise Child. He'll never agree. He might if I asked him, Juniper said softly. We all stopped what we were doing and stared at Juniper in surprise. I would love to be able to say that you must not do it, she went on, because the whole idea terrifies me. However, because the Doran spirit is strong within you at the moment, I dare not forbid you, though I still hope you won't go. The spirit has its own energy, which you are clearly feeling, something that your actions the other day also suggested. In one sense, the fact that you are still a child is irrelevant. I also believe that Uni and the Mother will protect you. But oh, my darling Wise Child, I am also very frightened. Wise Child came to Juniper and put her arms around her. Juniper picked her up, sat her on her lap, and rocked her. My little girl. What about Cormac and Coleman? Wise Child said after a bit. Juniper raised her eyes at Cormac, who gave her his gentle, lopsided grin. Do you think I would let Wise Child run into danger if I could be there to help her? He said. Wise Child beamed at Cormac. There was an awkward silence after all these feelings had been laid bare, and I felt the others were waiting for me to speak. I found it difficult to believe what I had been hearing. With all we knew about the wickedness of the Grey Knight and Marut, it seemed madness to risk putting ourselves in their hands. It was like putting one's head into a lion's mouth. Juniper and Finbar had only just escaped with their lives at Caerleon many years before, and yet Juniper, whose common sense and wisdom I had always revered, seemed to think that the scheme might be possible. I don't know, I heard myself saying reluctantly. I am Wise Child's friend, and I hope I am not a coward. But this plan seems dangerous beyond belief. What if Marut smells us out with her magical powers? We shall barely get across the doorstep. In the 2 days that followed, we went ahead with the tasks needed to get the gold onto Finbar's ship. Wise Child and I carried lots of wood down to the ledge, no easy task, and found an old blanket to cover it and keep it dry. We borrowed a tin cupboard from the kitchen of the royal apartments and put a tinderbox and candle inside it. We also hid some oil, which we would use to start the fire. It seemed to me that, fog apart, there would be a clear view of our signal from a ship at sea. Lion came up from the village with 3 donkeys and tied them outside his workshop. We checked that the bags of gold would slip easily into the donkeys' saddlebags. By common consent, we did not discuss Wise Child's daring project. I felt a sense of shame at my reluctance to participate, and a slight coolness from Wise Child. This hurt, especially since I had enjoyed the renewed warmth of our friendship after the day she found her way through the tunnel. In our minds, we followed Finbar back to his ship, calculating where he had got to as he returned to the ship, and then began his voyage along the coast. It was exciting. I realized that I liked the feeling of doing something a little daring, not least because the plan felt a manageable one. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, in the last of the daylight, Wise Child and I went to and fro carrying big jugs of water that, in case of emergency, I could use to douse the flames. Then, taking some of the wood we had stored, but leaving some more to keep the fire going, we carefully built our bonfire as a sort of pyramid. There was a hole in the side where I could wriggle in with a lighted candle and set light to some oil-soaked rags and twigs before getting out quickly, so that the bigger sticks and branches would catch alight. The ledge was big enough for me to get quite a long way away from the fire, which I guessed might be very hot when it got going properly. From about midnight, I stayed on the ledge, wearing all the warm clothes I had been able to fit onto myself at the royal apartments. Huddled among the rocks, I was out of the worst of the cold, but whenever I ventured onto the cliff, it was very cold indeed. There was no fog that I could see, which was a relief, and no rain, but it was windy, which would make the fire catch, but also might make it hard to control. A little later, Cormac appeared and said that they were about to take the donkeys down to the cove. If by any chance Finbar did not show, they would simply come back again, and we would return the next night. There was no sight or sound of any soldiers, so we hoped the mission could be safely achieved, though I noticed that the moon was nearly full and cast a great deal of light. If the soldiers wanted to make a nighttime visit, this night would be ideal. My eyes continually scanned the sea for sight of Finbar's ship, and then, was I imagining things? Yes. No. Yes. His riding lights were really there. With shaking hands, I opened the tinderbox, worked away with the flint, and lit the candle. I had already practiced this a few times. Placing my body between it and the wind, though it still flickered alarmingly, then I climbed into the fire according to plan and put the candle to the twigs and some of the oil-soaked cloths we had used. The flames caught quite quickly, setting the twigs alight, and then, more slowly, the sticks above them, and finally the branches. As I drew away from the fire, our signal shone out bravely into the night. I could see nothing of what went on down below, whether a boat had already put out for Finbar's ship, but I waited patiently, knowing that I would know nothing until the party returned. I felt triumphant. At this very moment, the men were probably heaving the gold onto Finbar's ship. For a little while, I felt very happy. Then suddenly, unbelievably, I heard the jingle of harness and the calling out of orders. It came from far away, carried on the wind, so much so that for a moment I doubted whether I had heard it at all. But every time I decided I had made it up, the sound returned. I groaned aloud. I did not fear that I would be caught or seen up on the cliff. The footing was too dangerous for horses in the dark, and the signal faced outward and could probably not be seen inland. But the others. Even as I listened, I could hear the sound of hooves and harness moving down in the direction of the harbor. In desperation, I snatched up one of the jugs and began to pour water wildly over the fire. The first jug seemed not to make much difference, but after I had poured the second one, the fire quickly died down, and at the third jug the fire was nearly doused. My fear was that, with the all-clear signal having already reached them, Finbar and his men might have given up watching the light and be concentrating on the arrival of the boat. Yet, was it my imagination, or did I hear a cry from the Trinity? I was not sure. Cold as it was up there on the cliff, I found myself sweating in fear as I thought of Juniper, Cormac, Wisechild, and Lion, and his men falling into appalling danger. When I had put out the fire, I noticed that Finbar's ship had pulled anchor and was sailing out into the bay. Should I go down to the harbor? No, it would not help if I ran into the soldiers and got myself arrested. I made quite sure the fire was extinguished, stamped on the last embers, hid the cupboard among the rocks, and headed back to the royal apartments with a heavy heart. Once inside, I locked the door and went to bed, lying there unsleeping in an agony of mind as I imagined all of the others arrested, to suffer God knew what fate at the hands of Perquin or the Grey Knight. The time went slowly by, and I tried to work out what was the next thing for me to do. To talk to Lion's wife, perhaps? Suddenly I heard a tapping on the door, and I got up and crept toward it. The handle turned as it had done before, but the gentle tapping which continued did not seem to be the way that soldiers would knock. I got close to the door and listened, and to my huge relief heard the complaining voice of Wisechild. I do wish he'd hurry up. I'm frozen. I threw open the door. Outside stood Juniper, Wisechild, and Cormac. What happened? What happened? I shouted at them. I felt a sudden anger after all the fear and distress I had known. It's all right, Coleman, Juniper said. Nothing happened except that Finbar collected the money from us and sailed safely away. But when the soldiers arrived, what did you do? I was still shouting as if my feelings of relief were bursting out of me. When we reached Finbar's ship, one of his men noticed that your signal had changed, and therefore we knew something was wrong. We did not go back to the harbor. There is a sea entrance to the Cave of Mermaids, and we sailed into it and anchored the boat there. We had to wait for a while in case the soldiers were waiting for us somewhere, but since we were using no lights, we don't believe the soldiers even knew we were there. Eventually, we left the boat in the cave and came back here on foot. Suddenly, to my embarrassment, I started to cry. I thought I had lost you all, I said, doing my unsuccessful best to stop my lips from trembling and brushing the tears out of my eyes. It must have been awful for you, Juniper said kindly. But how lucky you heard the soldiers and changed the signal. You saved us. Lion got back all right, then? I asked gruffly, trying to pull myself together. Yes, everyone's fine. All in all, a successful evening. Just as I was dropping off to sleep, something occurred to me. What happened to the donkeys? I asked. We took off their saddles and let them wander on the beach. Wise Child replied sleepily, "You know what donkeys are for wondering. No one would think anything of it."